Welcome to the Leading at the Next Level podcast with Dove Development Consulting, the show built to provide ongoing support for your leadership journey. Before we move into today's lesson, let's make sure we're on the same page. We've seen firsthand how much more is required to provide authentic leadership to a team than to simply manage based on the authority that comes with a title or a position. What we've learned through more than 50 combined years of leadership responsibility is that taking the extra steps to serve people and earn influence always produces more results than barking orders ever could. If you'll stick with us to the end of this episode, we'll share how you can get a complimentary trial to a resource that we've built that's like nothing else you've ever seen. With that in mind, let's get to work. This episode picks up where we left off last time on the cost of high turnover. We're going to look at how far that really extends into every organization. The high cost of turnover, it certainly shows up on a balance sheet because, gosh, it's a huge profitability killer, but a company's bank account isn't all that takes a hit when great team members are making a conscious decision to jump ship. I promise you. Just as that top-down leadership and that poor communication that we looked at before in this program both play such a part in so many other areas of how a business operates, high voluntary turnover impacts far more than just a need to stick that now hiring sign out along the street in front of the building. Now, an article I found on Indeed when I was digging into this, it was called Hidden Employee Turnover Costs, 7 Things to Consider. It lists these. It said the hiring process itself, onboarding and training, productivity, engagement, morale and company culture, work quality, the time the role is empty. Now, in far too many cases, the only costs that I've seen organizations consider with turnover are tied to directly to the hiring process. And even then, it's usually just the expenses that have been paid out to some external source, say a recruiter or a newspaper or hiring platform, the background checks, the drug screen fees, etc. I've rarely seen a company calculate the internal costs tied to the time invested in creating, say, a job post, screening candidates. And here's where I'm going to say just those two, creating the job posts and screening candidates, can be significant costs, even before considering the other 6 that are on the list, right? So in the 4th lesson of our recruitment, retention, and culture course, Cindy and I covered the importance of a strong onboarding process. Now, I don't want you to confuse that with orientation that's on an employee's first day. And we really dig into the financial impact effective onboarding can have. So I'm not going to hash that all out again here. If you've not been through that course, I'd encourage you to check it out or reach out to us on that. We also go into specific detail later on in that lesson, showing how much later in this lesson, we're going to go into specific detail showing about how much profitability is killed by poor engagement, low morale, or in this series rather. But just now, I want you to know that high voluntary turnover weighs heavily into both how the orientation, the onboarding matters, and as well as the engagement and the morale and so on. Right now, let's stick with how this particular profitability killer spills into productivity, work quality, and the impact and empty role, those things that referenced in that list, and how those all end up reaching the customers that we're serving. Now, a while back in our Leading at the Next Level program, this program, if you will, I shared a lesson where I cited some statistics about the time it takes a new employee to become profitable in their role. Now, in short, the study I referenced showed that the break-even point for an organization hiring somebody new was usually around 6 months, meaning that specific team member was typically costing the organization money until that point, just on their individual productivity. Truth be told, there was even more cost involved when you considered that anybody that's training them, they're losing productivity time as well. So they're not being fully productive if they've got to stop and train and so on. But it's part of the process, right? Additionally, which employees are most likely to make quality-related errors? Well, I'm going to make it easy for you. It's the newer ones. And I realize that this is part of the training curve, but it still comes at a cost. These mistakes, they lead to work being redone in a best case scenario. Sometimes it's a product that's got to be scrapped in many cases. And gosh, how much of an impact is it when an inferior product or service reaches the customer because of that person that's still in the training process. I'm going to go so far as to say that generally has one of the highest costs as if it gets out the door, right? Even higher than scrapping it entirely. So what about the costs that list referenced to a role being empty? Now, depending on what role it is, it could take weeks or even months to find the right person, even in the best of times. But when voluntary turnover in our organization is already high, this is even more difficult, and it tends to stretch that time out even longer. Now, what happens to that work during this time when that role's not filled? If you've ever been in a salaried role, you probably know where I'm going with this, especially if you've been in a salaried role where at the end of a year, you've had several weeks of paid time off left over. And my goodness, the work's still got to be done, right? As a salaried employee, we would tend to either take it with us on a vacation, that work, or we just didn't take the time off at all. I've had to do both. When a critical position on our staff, when it's empty, the work either lands on somebody else's desk, somebody who probably already has a full plate, or we have to pass it off so some of those folks can absorb it. They might have to work extra hours. And in many cases, some of that work ends up falling through the cracks until somebody's there. Either way, this is an added cost of turnover that hardly ever gets captured. We don't recognize it because it's not something that's easily seen. Unfortunately, I don't think that's where it stops. We're going to touch briefly on how this can impact our own work performance as well as an overall company culture before we start to unpack several ways we can give our best team members that real reason to stick with the team, a reason to stay, if you will. So imagine that you're overseeing a team of folks already have, and all of them already have an incredibly high workload to produce for the customers. And it seems like all you personally get done is interview, hire, train new employees. Some of the ones coming on board, they connect with the team, they stick around, but a high number never stay long enough to really learn the role or reach a reasonable level of productivity. The only option at that point is to start the process all over again. And dear God, then again, we've got to do it over and over and over. As leaders, we've got so many other responsibilities to see through that this is pulling us away from, right? Talk about taking the wind out of our sails. Oh my goodness. I wanted to call this part of the lesson, this slide, if you will, sucking the life out of us. But I thought that might have been a little bit too much, regardless of how painfully accurate it would have been. If we're really going to consider the extended reach of turnover costs, we can't overlook the impact it has on employee engagement, or how that impact on employee engagement can drive even higher turnover costs. We'll go into some specific details of just how big that profitability killer of poor employee engagement is soon enough. So I'm not going to hash all that data out right here. What I do need you to consider, though, is how high turnover begats low employee engagement, and how low employee engagement begats high turnover. Then guess what that begats? Truth be told, I believe this kind of begatting could go all the way back from the generations from Adam to Noah. And if you're not tracking with me on the begats and the references there, start at the beginning of the book, read forward, you'll see it pretty quickly. But as we look at who pays that price for the high turnover, as we looked at it, I've referenced that I'm convinced it's everybody connected to the organization, both internally and externally. The biggest part of this challenge, though, often falls squarely in the laps of those of us who are supervising, managing, or even running the entire business. Now, while we're certainly not the only ones who feel the effects of high turnover, it adds to our workload in ways that other team members don't often realize. A while back, I wrote an article on LinkedIn that compared the ideas of employee happiness, employee satisfaction, and employee engagement. And I got a comment soon after that from somebody stating that all of them were always these fuzzy initiatives driven by somebody in an HR role that never really yields a tangible result. And their words were, here's the quote from it, because they said, most CEOs continue to sit on the sidelines and let HR whack away at the problem. Now, here's my response. And I sent this back, but I want to emphasize it here. If leaders in an organization are willing to place complete responsibility for turnover or employee engagement solely on whoever carries that human resource title, is wearing that hat on any given day, then I'd expect it would likely remain fuzzy. And I'd also expect turnover to remain high even within that human resource department. I'd also expect employee engagement to remain low and a ton of profitability to be lost. Failing to accept that responsibility for tracking tangible results from any initiative is a profitability killer that I believe is going to warrant our attention here soon. So I'll save that, but just know it's coming. Since my goal right here and now, though, is to point out how high turnover yielding low engagement, yielding high turnover perpetuates itself, I want to challenge you to consider how much of this spills over into every single team member around us. As leaders, we've typically prepared ourselves to handle tougher times. It's part of our job. It's part of what comes with it. Just imagine the downward spiral, though, that this takes, and how it takes the wind out of the sails of a team member who hasn't necessarily prepared themselves for the high turnover, the extras that comes with it, and somebody that's likely not nearly as bought into the organization as we are. Now, as these two things continue begatting each other, low engagement, high turnover engagement, the amount of profitability that's lost continues to compound, and we'll soon take a look at the toll on the culture and the values as well. So the extended reach of high turnover, it certainly does its part in taking the wind out of our sails, right? When it comes to how active we are in driving our organization forward, but it also takes a toll on the whole organization's culture in a couple of critical ways. Now, before we go into those ways, I want you to think about what it would feel like if you're on a ship, say in the Caribbean, where the water's just beautiful, and you see dozens of people just jumping overboard, jumping over the side of the ship. Gosh, you look around, the ship doesn't appear to be sinking. You've not heard an alarm. You've not heard an announcement pointing to an immediate danger. But I guess you'd still be wondering, what in the world's going on? What's causing so many people to make such a drastic decision? As time passes, there's still a steady stream of folks grabbing whatever they can find to help them stay afloat when they go into shark-infested water, and they take it over the side into the ocean with them. Sooner or later, gosh, even the best of us, we're going to wonder, what do they know that we don't? Well, for the ones of us that stick it out, changes are inevitable, right? The buffet lines, they're probably not going to be as long, and it's going to be easier to find a seat by the pool, but we're going to likely inherit a few other things that are less desirable too, especially if many of the folks who took the plunge were part of the crew. We might find ourselves in a spot where we're cooking the meals or even steering the ship. When turnover's high in an organization, it's not all that different, is it? Responsibilities can change quickly. Work can pile up fast. It can cause significant pressure to fill open spots with just about anybody who appears remotely qualified. And this can make a significant difference in the culture in a really short period of time. And depending on which roles those remotely qualified folks fill, there could be some mismatches with the organization's long-standing values. I've seen it. And not only that, those new folks coming in can create a dip in what the company had been previously known for, the drop in morale among the folks that are still there. That can weigh just as heavily. The longer high turnover continues, the farther the company can move from what had been a robust history of maintaining a top-notch culture with strong values, and it can become a place that accepts nearly any warm body that applies. And if you want to have a deeper conversation on that, gosh, let's talk personally. Just like high turnover begats poor engagement begats high turnover, that same downward spiral can be seen with how turnover affects culture as well as the values that culture was built on, right? While this spills over into the recruiting process, a profitability killer that we're going to look at next in the next lesson I share in this program, an intentional approach to really providing team members with a reason to stay is often one of the best investments that we as leaders can make. Now, moving forward here, as we wrap this up today, we're going to work through some very specific things that we can do to reduce that voluntary turnover, so we're capturing all that unnecessarily lost profit as much as we can anyway, and so we can increase engagement while we uphold those strong values to build an even stronger company culture. Thanks for listening to the Leading at the Next Level podcast. Next time, we'll pick up where we left off by looking at how important it is for each of us to give those team members that we count so much on a reason to stay with the organization, and how that helps us avoid those high turnover costs we've been looking at. Now, if you'd like to go deeper into anything that we've shared here, or you need continuing education credits for your professional credential, send us an email at admin@dove-development.net, and we'll be happy to hook you up with a 45-day all-access trial of our complete Leading at the Next Level program at no cost. The full program, it includes access to well over 100 hours of digital lessons, complete with slides and action-based assessments to help you capture measurable bottom line improvements in your organization. And it also includes 2 live lessons each month with Q&A, so we can really help you identify the specific action that you want to take to lead your team more effectively.